Hi there, I'm Oliver Smith and I'm the product manager for Ubuntu Desktop here at Canonical. On the 20th of April, Ubuntu 23.04 released, and for Ubuntu Desktop that meant a whole host of new features when it comes to usability improvements for desktop applications, but also the first time user experience when it comes to installing Ubuntu Desktop, as well as laying the strategic groundwork for longer term changes when it comes to desktop installation and customization at scale, and then management of your desktop fleet inside wider organizations, particularly organizations that are heavily Windows based. In this roundtable discussion, I'm going to be joined by a number of desktop engineering managers as well as other product managers from Canonical to talk more about the new features. Let's get started. Okay, so now I'm joined with Jean-Baptiste, who's the engineering manager for Enterprise Desktop, and Ken Van Dyne, who's the engineering manager for both the desktop gaming experience and the sort of broader user experience. So let's get started with the new desktop installer, which is probably our biggest feature for Ubuntu 23.04. And the sort of interesting thing is it sort of had two major underlying changes. The one is the sort of base behind the scenes technology, which now leverages the Ubuntu server installer. And then also in terms of the user facing side, we've had an opportunity to redesign the first time user experience with Flutter. So maybe Ken, you could start us off talking about the reasons why we've gone with sort of both of those directions.
Sure. So we had a strong desire to kind of unify our technologies used for their server installer and the desktop installer. We had two separate installers before. Now Ubiquity, which is a server installer, is the back end for our new desktop installer. And this surfaces some very interesting capabilities that we've leveraged before with server. Now we'll be able to leverage those for desktop. Jean-Baptiste here will talk about that a little bit later. We also have recently been investing heavily in bringing Flutter to Linux. Desktop in particular, and this was a great opportunity for us to kind of stress test Flutter and build out that ecosystem to provide all the things necessary to bring a rich application like an installer to life.
I think it's really interesting that we've been able to iterate rapidly using Flutter to give a much nicer coat of paint to that first time user experience. And I think one thing I've really appreciated is how we've made the sort of default through line very simple and clear. It's very easy for people to just get started with Ubuntu, but at the same time, we've added more nuances that enable people who have more complex setups, who want to dive into that detail. They still have access to those layers of information and those tools to achieve their goals, which I think is a really important balance to strike. Right, we've got two very different sort of sets of users in that instance. I think the unification with the server installer is also particularly interesting because there's a whole number of new capabilities that Ubuntu Server has benefited from that we can now leverage on Ubuntu Desktop as well. So maybe Jean-Baptiste, you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, exactly. Since we are relying on the same technologies as the server, we can do, of course, manual installations through the GUI, but also fully automated installation or semi-automated installation. So with a fully automated installation, you can start from a blank Ubuntu desktop and fully customize the installation. So you can do the partitioning, you can install extra packages, you can connect to IDE, for example, and really adapt the Ubuntu image to your needs. There's also a new feature, for example, when you want to do a semi-automated installation. So we've added AD provisioning. So with AD provisioning, you don't want to store credentials, for example, in the automated installation file. So you start the installation, it will go to the point it asks you for your password or your credential of your admin, and then you enter it and you can continue automatically to install Ubuntu. So you don't have to have custom images from scratch. You start from a vanilla Ubuntu, add a customization file, and fully install your fleet of Ubuntu machines this way.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of sort of administrators will be more familiar with, right? The idea of starting from a vanilla base image and then layering on those customizations and additional packages at install time, rather than having to come pre-prepared with a fully bespoke ISO. So I think that's just another option, another tool in their belt in terms of how to bring those new images into their organization. All right, so that was the new desktop installer, and now let's continue the thread about Ubuntu in the enterprise and start to talk a little bit more about the management story. So Jean-Baptiste is still here, but now we've got Massimiliano, who is the product manager for identity at Canonical, and also I've got Rajan here, who is the product manager for landscape. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we integrate with both Microsoft identity services, but also where landscape fits into that picture. And I think that how we work hard to sort of make these things play nicely together. So obviously, one of the most common scenarios that we have is organizations or institutions where they're predominantly Windows-based, but they want to empower a team of developers with Linux workstations, and at the same time, they don't want that additional overhead of managing sort of two different estates with two different sets of tools. So we'll talk in a bit about our existing sort of on-premise Active Directory support, but really I would like Massi to open by talking about our new Azure Active Directory user authentication and what the sort of motivation behind introducing this new feature was.
So 2304 is the first and only Linux distribution that is adding Azure AD authentication, meaning that users can use their Microsoft 365 or Azure credentials to authenticate into their Linux machines. The feature is available for free for 2304 only, and once we are confident that everything works fine, we will port it to 2204 as well. Another important point is Microsoft Intune. So Microsoft Intune was released for Ubuntu 2004 and 2204 in October of last year, and it can be used by administrator to centrally manage compliance information about their machine, and also use this compliance information to make better, more educated access decisions for their Azure AD protected resources. And finally, we work with the Microsoft Defender team to make sure that the Microsoft Defender Vulnerability Center consumes CV information directly from the Ubuntu sources. So everything that you see in /security/CV in Ubuntu now is reflected into the Microsoft Defender platform.
So they're getting those reports in the same place that they're having for the rest of their fleet, or using the same tools to access that information. Fantastic. And this is a separate initiative to the sort of on-premise Active Directory work that we've been doing ever since sort of Ubuntu 2004 and 2204, which is still largely where a lot of enterprises already are, right? They might be planning their cloud migration to this, to Azure AD, in which case we want to make sure that we're not a blocker to that migration, but at the same time we also want to make sure we're delivering a really robust solution for the sort of traditional Active Directory domain services. So maybe Jean-Baptiste, you could talk a little bit about our offering in that space.
Precisely. So organizations are slowly moving to the cloud, but they are working in an hybrid mode where the identity provider is still Active Directory on-premise. So for 2204, we release ATSYS. It's a native GPO client for Ubuntu. It can use SSSD or WinBind to connect to the Active Directory and provide many advanced features to control the Ubuntu desktop. So you can control the settings of the desktop. So anything from the background to what's in the launcher and the application you're allowed to launch. You support privilege management. You support script execution, so on boot or when the user logs in. So that's extremely powerful. And from 2304, we have a network share support, so to decide who has access to which network resources. Application confinement, which allows an admin to block the execution of certain process or restrict the access to certain file on the machine, and global proxy support. So we'll continue extending this solution for the next releases. So I won't tell what now, but yes, that's a broadly used solution right now.
Fantastic. So we can encourage sort of administrators to kick the tires on our user authentication with Azure AD, but then also check out these extended policy supports ahead of them both coming back to 2204, and obviously they'll be included in the next LTS release 2404. But Rajan, we have another management tool in the form of landscape. So can you tell us a little bit about how these things fit together and interact with each other?
Well, users of Landscape today are already quite comfortable with using Active Directory with Landscape. So, and this is classic Active Directory. The new ask is how can we integrate with Azure Active Directory? And there's two parts to this. There's incorporating the Azure Active Directory or the Active Directory with your Landscape installation. And then the second part is how can we manage the rollout of Active Directory across all of the desktops that we may be managing with Landscape. And so Massey did an interesting video but recently, and it covered the steps that an administrator would have to take to enroll an Ubuntu desktop into Azure Active Directory. And what we can do now is take those steps, put them into Landscape, and roll those steps out across your entire Ubuntu enterprise at scale, and enroll all of your Ubuntu workstations to Azure Active Directory. While some of these features may seem like they require a lot of manual, step-by-step interaction with Landscape to accomplish today, the future of Landscape will be a lot more streamlined.
Okay, now we're coming up to the closing section of this discussion, and we brought back Ken, but also I'm very happy to introduce Tim, who is the new engineering director for Ubuntu Desktop. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
Looking forward to hearing more from you. But first, let's maybe cover gaming, because I think one of the most exciting things that coincides with this release is the creation of the Steam Snap. So let's sort of rewind a bit and think about what it means for a desktop experience and gaming. Gaming is such a core part of so many of our users' lives. We want to make sure that if you're using Ubuntu Desktop, you can use it for both work and play. And so making sure that the gaming experience is highly polished is a really critical part of providing that well-rounded experience. So we know there are a lot of gamers who are already using Ubuntu. You can look at things like the Steam Hardware Survey and see, I think there's something like 150,000 monthly active Steam gamers running the latest Ubuntu. And they're also very keen to get things like the latest drivers, so they're often very early adopters of interim releases like Ubuntu 23.04. So we've been investing in a dedicated gaming engineering team. And one of the first things we've done is actually package Steam as a snap. And I guess the first question is, what are the advantages of packaging Steam as a snap, Ken?
Sure. First off, dependencies. Typically as a gamer, when you try to start playing your games on Linux, there's kind of an art to it. You need to enable some PPAs, you want to get certain things installed, you need to get 32-bit libraries because many of the games are only published as 32-bit binaries. And these things aren't necessarily simple to install out of the box. So by bundling all this in a snap, we're able to include all those libraries in a way where you just simply snap install Steam or click on it in the Snap Store, and you have a working gaming environment right out of the box. Of those libraries, one of the more interesting ones there is Mesa, which is a user space driver for AMD and Intel graphics. Oftentimes people are led to, via forums and things like that to enable PPAs to get much more aggressive, newer, bleeding edge versions of Mesa. The downside of that is then you're kind of tainting your everyday work environment where your desktop shell, for example, your applications are also using this very new version of these drivers, which may be unstable. So we're able to deliver these bleeding edge, very aggressively versioned Mesa drivers as part of that Steam Snap. And we've also even unwind that a little bit so you can choose your level of aggressiveness. How new do you want those drivers to be? And it's in a controlled environment where it only affects your gaming experience in the Steam Snap, which I think is a very compelling story. I think that's very cool. So you can very easily, you automatically get a very new version of Mesa and other libraries when you install the Steam Snap, but then you can even turn that up and get much more aggressive if you'd like.
Fantastic. It's been great to see the community really sort of embracing this. We've done a number of testing weeks where people have been comparing games to ProtonDB, making sure that we're matching the ratings on that site, which has been very helpful. We've been I think we've had something like 90,000, I was looking at the other day, 90,000 installs of the Steam Snap. So that's quite a healthy user base already while it was in early access, and now we've moved it into stable. I think it should be a lot more accessible for users going forward. So I'm really excited to see how people pick up on this, whether it streamlines their experience. There's still things we want to add and improve and include going forward, but I think what we've got now is a really strong out-of-the-box experience for people who are maybe not as familiar with Linux, maybe not as comfortable using the command line. Okay, so wrapping up, let's talk about the future. Ubuntu 23.04 is just released, and we're already planning and starting to make progress on Ubuntu 23.10 behind the scenes. I'm not sure we can quite go into details about the specifics of what's going to be included there, but I'm sure people will be gradually picking up on those things over the next few months. But I think really what it'd be interesting to talk about, Tim, is that longer term strategic direction, because a lot of the things we've talked about today are sort of a step forward on a journey towards a number of sort of significant endpoints when it comes to things like enterprise management or the gaming experience, or ultimately sort of image customization for Ubuntu Desktop. So maybe Tim, do you want to sort of bring us your thoughts on what the future of Ubuntu Desktop is starting to look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ollie. I mean, we've been looking and receiving lots of feedback from our users, and we do take that very seriously, and we've used a lot of that to help devise and inform our strategy on what the longer term vision is. So the bits I want to touch on today specifically are user experience and security. So let's start with user experience, and we've already touched on the wonderful new Flutter installer, which is a significant step forward in terms of just having it look nicer and be more pleasant to use. But also under the hood with Ken and his team, they've done fantastic work in using Flutter and Dart as a more modern toolkit to build that Flutter installer. So from a front end, it's easier for now for people in the community to contribute, because it's not a set of technologies that are quite old. It's a very modern, cool, trendy thing that you can have skills that maybe now transfer to your other job. Maybe you're writing an app for an Android phone. So on that, I think there's a lot of really interesting things that we're doing. I think in addition to that, we're looking at, what is the software management experience like on Ubuntu? So at the moment, it's a bit confusing. Maybe when you get search results for software, there's lots of things going on there. So we are starting to look at a multi-cycle kind of refresh and overhaul for how software is managed on the Ubuntu desktop. For this cycle in particular, we're looking at the software management store. So there is an early build in the Snap store, but we're going to put a lot more emphasis on that, do a lot more design, so that it's not just about the store, it's more about zooming out in what is a software management process like. And so as we start to address all these paper cuts, I think the user experience should improve across it. And it's not something we'll get done in a single release. It will take time and effort to get that done.
Sort of a natural progression, right, of that first time user experience that we've started with the installer. Now they've got to the desktop, and what do they need to do? They need to find the applications that they're familiar with. They need to look for applications that should probably be recommended to them. So we're helping. We're just continuing the story that we've started in this release.
Yeah, the user journey should feel consistent as you go through, and at the moment, there's areas and things we need to improve on. But I think as we iterate each time, it should get better and march us towards a better user experience. Finally, the last area is really on security, and I think the security story is interesting because we can go down lots of conversations about this technology or that technology, but actually, what's important in security is you kind of step back and you think of security from a first principles approach. So we think of things like confidentiality, availability, and integrity, not thinking about whether or not we have this type of encryption or that type of firewall. Those are controls that are used and applied to achieve confidentiality, availability, and integrity. So as we step back and we start thinking about security on the desktop, we need to have a holistic approach that is making sure that when we do choose technologies to help improve the security on the desktop, it's done in a way that yes, brings security, but also is user-friendly, right? Because we don't want our security solutions to be clunky or unfriendly to users, because if security gets in the way, then typically it just gets disabled. So we want to have something that's both secure and user-friendly, and then I think we can start to really improve the security experience on Ubuntu.
Yeah, this is about making sure that everybody can get the benefits of security, rather than it being sort of the niche of someone who, either an administrator or someone who is a Linux expert, taking control of that, making that much more available. That's really exciting. I'm already looking forward to the next release. But I think for now and today, that's all we've got time for. So thank you so much for sharing
Thank
your
you,
thoughts,
Ken.
Tim. Thank you, Ken, for coming. I'd love to say thank you to Massey, Rajan, and Jean-Baptiste for joining us earlier. Yes, thank you everyone for watching, and we'll leave you with some links and resources to get started with Ubuntu 23.04. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Take care.